Chernobyl gave us an explosion. A 2,000-ton lid flipping like a coin, a pillar of light, the sky ripped open. You can make a movie about that. You can point a camera at fire. Fukushima gives us a drip. February 7th, 2024. A contract worker at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant is walking past the high-temperature incinerator building when he notices something that shouldn't be there. Water, pooling on the ground beneath an air vent connected to a caesium adsorption device. He calls it in at 8:52 in the morning. By 9, they've closed the valve. But here's what keeps me up at night. That leak wasn't caught by sensors. It wasn't flagged by alarms. It wasn't detected by any of the monitoring systems that TEPCO spent billions installing. A guy looked down and saw a puddle. That's it. That's the safety net. I pulled TEPCO's own incident report. The water that escaped, 5.5 cubic meters of it, contained an estimated 22 billion becquerels of radioactive caesium and strontium. Some of it had already seeped into the soil. Japan's economy minister went on record practically begging TEPCO to do better. One mistake, he said, and they lose public trust entirely. But it wasn't one mistake. 6 months later, August 2024, 25 tons of radioactive water leak from a surge tank connected to the Unit 2 reactor building. April 2024, the IAEA is quietly informed that inspectors found corrosion and flaking paint on 3 water storage tanks. Each time, TEPCO delivers the same line: no impact outside the site boundary. Each time, the world nods and moves on. I used to nod too. Then I started looking at what's actually inside those tanks. There are over 1,000 of them. Steel cylinders packed across the plant grounds like a metallic forest, holding more than 1.3 million cubic meters of water that has touched melted nuclear fuel. And as of December 2024, roughly 70% of that water still exceeds Japan's own regulatory standards for radioactive contamination, even after treatment. So what exactly are they planning to do with it? To understand what's in those tanks, you need to understand the machine that fills them. And it never stops. March 11th, 2011. 3 reactor cores at Fukushima Daiichi lost cooling after the tsunami knocked out the backup generators. The uranium fuel overheated, melted, and dripped through the reactor vessels like candle wax through a grate, mixing with steel, zirconium cladding, concrete, and anything else it touched on the way down. An estimated 880 tons of this molten debris solidified inside the 3 reactors. It is still there, still generating heat, and it still needs water poured over it every single day to keep it from getting worse. Here's the trap. Imagine your basement floods every morning, and the floodwater is poison, and you can't fix the broken pipe, because the pipe is made of melted nuclear fuel. That's Fukushima. Water goes in clean. It passes over the debris. It comes out carrying up to 62 different radioactive isotopes: cesium-137, strontium-90, cobalt-60, iodine-129, traces of plutonium. Some of the most dangerous liquid on the planet, and you've just manufactured another 100 cubic meters of it. By tomorrow, you'll make 100 more. But the cooling water isn't even the worst part. I spent hours staring at the site's topographic maps, and it hit me. The plant sits on a hillside. Groundwater flows downhill, straight through the cracked foundations of the reactor buildings. Rain falls into structures that no longer have intact roofs. At the crisis peak, nearly 400 tons of new contaminated water were appearing every day. Not because anyone pumped it in, but because the earth itself kept delivering it. They fought back. A frozen soil wall, 1,500 meters of refrigerated pipes buried around the reactor buildings to block groundwater. Sub-drain pumps, asphalt paving to reduce rain infiltration. All of it helped. The daily flow dropped, but it didn't stop. Then there's ALPS, the Advanced Liquid Processing System. The filtration machine that's supposed to make this water safe. It runs the contaminated water through chemical reactions and absorbent columns, stripping out 62 radionuclides. But it can't remove tritium, a radioactive form of hydrogen that's bonded into the water molecule itself. And it can't remove carbon-14. And in the early years, when the priority was speed over precision, the equipment malfunctioned repeatedly. Batches were rushed through half-treated. The result? 1 million tons of water that was supposed to be clean, and wasn't. So what do you do when you're out of room, out of patience, and the water keeps coming? You look at the ocean. That's exactly what Japan did. August 24th, 2023. TEPCO opens a valve and begins pumping treated water through a pipeline that runs 1 kilometer under the seabed and out into the Pacific. The plant empty every tank on the site over the next 30 to 40 years. Slow, steady, diluted, with seawater monitored at every stage. The IAEA gave its blessing. Their comprehensive review concluded the discharge was consistent with international safety standards. The projected radiation dose to the public, between 0.002 and 0.03 microsieverts per year. To put that in perspective, you get more radiation eating a banana. On paper, this should have been a non-story. It was not a non-story. China banned all Japanese seafood imports overnight and called the decision extremely selfish and irresponsible. Protesters marched through Seoul and tried to storm the Japanese embassy. Pacific Island nations demanded to know why they weren't consulted about radioactive material being pumped into their ocean. And in Fukushima itself, in the fishing towns that had spent a decade clawing their way back from ruin, the fishermen felt something worse than anger. They felt lied to. TEPCO had promised them, on the record, that it would not release the water without their consent. I read the science. I understand the tritium argument, but here's where it gets uncomfortable. Ken Buesseler, an oceanographer at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, raised a point that doesn't fit neatly into anyone's talking points. It's not the tritium that concerns him. It's the other isotopes, strontium-90, ruthenium-106, cobalt-60, that occasionally slip through the filtration process, that bioaccumulate in marine organisms and settle into seafloor sediments near the discharge point. And then there's TEPCO's track record. I keep coming back to it. For 2 years after the disaster, they denied contaminated groundwater was reaching the ocean. In 2013, they revised the strontium measurement in a single monitoring well from 900,000 becquerels per liter to 5 million. A 5-fold correction they blamed on a faulty measuring method. That same summer, 300 tons of highly contaminated water burst from a bolted flange storage tank and seeped into the ground. The puddle beside the tank was emitting 100 millisieverts per hour, equivalent to the 5-year exposure limit for a nuclear worker delivered in 60 minutes. If your water filter company tells you the water is safe, but their own records show the filter failed on most of what it processed, do you trust the filter or the company? But the water is just the problem you can see. The real nightmare is what's underneath those reactors, and no one can get to it. 880 tons. That's TEPCO's estimate. Some experts think it's higher. Nobody knows for certain, because in 14 years, no human being has been able to look at it directly and survive. I described earlier how the fuel melted down through the reactor vessels. But I didn't describe where it went. In each of the 3 damaged units, the molten fuel behaved differently. In some places, it pooled at the bottom of the primary containment vessel, hardening into irregular mounds. In others, it spattered sideways, coating grates and cable trays, welding itself to structural steel. It burned through pipes, dissolved electrical wiring into itself, and fused with the concrete floor. Every reactor is a unique disaster, a different shape of ruin, a different puzzle, with radiation levels that would kill an unshielded human in minutes. So they send robots, and the robots die. Since 2011, TEPCO has deployed machine after machine into the darkness of those containment vessels. Electronics fry, cameras fog. One robot got jammed in a passage and had to be abandoned inside the reactor permanently. Another piece of debris added to the pile it was sent to study. Then came September 2024. A new robot, an extendable arm assembled from 5 connected pipes, with tongs, a camera, and a light at the tip, entered Unit 2 on a mission that was supposed to be a breakthrough. Its task? Retrieve a sample of fuel debris. The amount they were aiming for? Less than 3 grams. A crumb. A speck of the monster. The mission took 2 weeks. 8 teams of 6 workers rotated through the reactor building, each team limited to 15 minutes maximum. Total working time, 2 hours per day. Every movement of the robot had to be guided with surgical precision through passages so narrow that one wrong angle meant the arm would jam, and the mission would be over. They got their sample. Less than a gram in the end. 3 years behind schedule. The head of Japan's nuclear regulatory body admitted publicly that the difficulty of retrieving even a handful of debris had become apparent. Now do the maths. 1 gram retrieved after 14 years of engineering. 880 tons still inside. TEPCO says full decommissioning will be done by 2051. Independent analysts suggest a century. The Japan Center for Economic Research has quietly modeled a third option, the confinement scenario. Don't remove the fuel, seal the reactors, walk away, manage the site forever. And then there's what we still can't see. In March 2024, TEPCO flew small drones into Unit 1, the most badly damaged reactor. The footage came back dark, grainy, disorienting, shapes dangling from above, lumps of something hanging in the blackness. TEPCO's own officials said they could not confirm whether the shapes were melted fuel or melted equipment. The drones were too light to carry dosimeters, so there were no radiation readings, just shapes in the dark. And somewhere behind the budget lines and decommissioning roadmaps, a question no one wants to answer. What does it cost to fight a monster you can't see, can't reach, and can't move? It costs more than anyone planned, and the bill keeps growing. I went through the numbers chronologically, and they read like a fever chart. When the Japanese government set the original decommissioning target in 2011, the estimate sat around 2 trillion yen, roughly $17 billion. That felt enormous at the time. By 2016, the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry had revised the total disaster cost to 21.5 trillion yen, $188 billion, nearly double the previous figure. Decommissioning alone had jumped fourfold to 8 trillion yen. And then, reality kept arriving. By August 2025, TEPCO had already spent or committed 5.2 trillion yen, $35 billion, on decommissioning work alone. That's before they've removed a single meaningful quantity of fuel debris, before they've dismantled a single reactor, before the hardest part has even started. The Japan Center for Economic Research ran its own projections and landed on a range that should make anyone sit down. Between 35 and 80 trillion yen. That's up to $660 billion for a single power plant. So who pays? I asked this question expecting a simple answer. I didn't get one. TEPCO was effectively nationalized after the disaster. The government took a controlling stake to keep the company from collapsing. Other Japanese nuclear operators contribute through a specially created decommissioning fund. But ultimately, the tab lands on Japanese taxpayers and electricity ratepayers, folded into their bills in increments so small most people don't notice, a surcharge on every kilowatt hour, stretching decades into the future. And the people doing the actual work? I found reporting that turned my stomach. Fukushima's cleanup runs on contract labor. Workers recruited through layers of subcontractors, sometimes 4 or 5 deep. Each layer skims a cut. The people at the bottom, the ones who actually enter the contaminated zones, are often paid barely above minimum wage. Investigative journalists have documented cases of organized crime syndicates recruiting homeless men and migrant workers for radiation cleanup. The men who absorb the dose are the men with the fewest choices. It took 237 billion yen and 10 years to build the 4 reactors at Fukushima Daiichi. It will take at least 30 times that to take them apart. If taking apart is even the right phrase anymore. Because at some point, a word starts to lose its meaning. You call it decommissioning when there's an end date. When the end date keeps moving, when the cost keeps doubling, when the fuel can't be reached and the water can't be stopped. What you're really describing isn't a project. It's an institution, a permanent one. And permanent institutions need something that no spreadsheet can guarantee. A future that holds together long enough to keep them running. Here's what keeps me staring at the ceiling. Fukushima Daiichi sits on the eastern coast of Honshu, Japan's main island, in the Pacific Ring of Fire, the most seismically violent belt on the planet. The earthquake that started all of this was magnitude 9.0, the most powerful ever recorded in Japan, strong enough to shift the island 8 feet to the east. That was not a once-and-forever event. In March 2024, a 5.8 magnitude quake struck the Fukushima coastal region and the ocean. Discharge had to be temporarily suspended. The earth beneath that plant has not finished moving. It will never finish moving. And the sea is rising. The tanks, the ice wall, the subdrain pumps, the concrete barriers, all of it was engineered for the coastline as it exists today. Climate projections for the coming century put significant sea level rise on the table for this stretch of the Japanese coast. Nobody has published a plan for what happens to a radioactive tank farm when the waterline advances. Perhaps because there is no plan. Perhaps because admitting you'd need one means admitting this isn't temporary. Now think about time. Not human time. Isotope time. Caesium-137 has a half-life of about 30 years. Strontium-90, 29 years. Those are the fast ones, the sprinters. Iodine-129 has a half-life of 15.7 million years. Plutonium-239, which is present in the fuel debris inside those reactors, takes 24,100 years to lose half its radioactivity. The language you're hearing this in will not exist in its current form by then. Neither will the institutions managing the site, unless something unprecedented happens, unless a single chain of human attention, funding, and engineering competence remains unbroken across centuries through wars and recessions and political collapses and natural disasters that haven't been imagined yet. Chernobyl's great unsolved problem is how to warn people 10,000 years from now about buried waste. Fukushima asks something quieter, and maybe worse. How do you keep a living, staffed, technologically current operation running for longer than most civilizations last? I keep coming back to that contract worker in February 2024. Walking past a building, looking down, seeing a puddle, no alarm, no siren. Just water where it shouldn't be, and a man who happened to notice. That's the whole story, really. Not an explosion, not a pillar of light. A drip in a tank on a coastline, on a fault line, on a warming planet. And someone has to keep watching. Someone always has to keep watching. If this changed how you think about nuclear energy, or about the stories we tell ourselves when we say a crisis is over, subscribe. There's more to uncover, and I'm not done digging. Here's what keeps me staring at the ceiling. Fukushima Daiichi sits on the eastern coast of Honshu, Japan's main island in the Pacific Ring of Fire, the most seismically violent belt on the planet. The earthquake that started all of this was magnitude 9.0, the most powerful ever recorded in Japan, strong enough to shift the island 8 feet to the east. That was not a once-and-forever event. In March 2024, a 5.8 magnitude quake struck the Fukushima coastal region, and the ocean discharge had to be temporarily suspended. The earth beneath that plant has not finished moving. It will never finish moving. And the sea is rising. The tanks, the ice wall, the subdrain pumps, the concrete barriers. All of it was engineered for the coastline as it exists today. Climate projections for the coming century put significant sea level rise on the table for this stretch of the Japanese coast. Nobody has published a plan for what happens to a radioactive tank farm when the waterline advances. Perhaps because there is no plan. Perhaps because admitting you'd need one means admitting this isn't temporary. Now think about time. Not human time. Isotope time. Caesium-137 has a half-life of about 30 years. Strontium-90, 29 years. Those are the fast ones, the sprinters. Iodine-129 has a half-life of 15.7 million years. Plutonium-239, which is present in the fuel debris inside those reactors, takes 24,100 years to lose half its radioactivity. The language you're hearing this in will not exist in its current form by then. Neither will the institutions managing the site unless something unprecedented happens, unless a single chain of human attention, funding, and engineering competence remains unbroken across centuries through wars and recessions and political collapses and natural disasters that haven't been imagined yet. Chernobyl's great unsolved problem is how to warn people 10,000 years from now about buried waste. Fukushima asks something quieter, and maybe worse. How do you keep a living, staffed, technologically current operation running for longer than most civilizations last? I keep coming back to that contract worker in February 2024. Walking past a building, looking down, seeing a puddle, no alarm, no siren, just water where it shouldn't be, and a man who happened to notice. That's the whole story, really. Not an explosion, not a pillar of light. A drip in a tank on a coastline, on a fault line, on a warming planet. And someone has to keep watching. Someone always has to keep watching. If this changed how you think about nuclear energy, or about the stories we tell ourselves when we say a crisis is over, subscribe. There's more to uncover, and I'm not done digging.